Hello. Hello and welcome. Welcome to our discussion, Reimagine the Internet, Affect, Velocity, Excess. This is the second day of the conference of Transmediale 2018. As you have probably heard already, this year at the conference, with the title Face Value, we are looking into how processes of value extraction and capital accumulation to a great extent involve the exploitation of social and cultural differences. And we are revisiting the relation of capitalism with racism and, of course, of value to values. Within this context, we are also especially interested in addressing issues of visibility and representation, and how these play out in today's commodified media sphere. So one of the questions that we want to ask is how diverse and multivocal really are today's algorithmically defined zones of communication. Zach Blas and Aria, that we're very happy to have here with us, are both artists and writers who discuss these issues in their work, sharing a common and vivid interest in the potential to move beyond constructed territories, to escape essentialisms, and to even more locate and enhance, let's say, the elements that can operate transversally. So revisiting the black radical thought of Cedric Robinson and Franz Fanon, but also the contemporary writings of Paul Preciado and Hito Steyer. In their recent works and writings, they have respectively discussed the potential of opacity, of blackness, of queerness, as elements that in a way can allow us to move towards new forms of collective thinking, active and being. We have invited Zach and Aria to engage in what we in a way call an unmoderated conversation. A discussion, a conversation that can be as vivid, as free, as open as they would like it to be. So what I just mentioned might or might not be a starting point for their conversation. And before giving the word to them, let me allow me to add a few more words that Zach Blas is an artist, writer and lecturer in visual cultures at Goldsmiths, University of London. He has exhibited and lectured internationally, and his articles and texts have been published widely. His work, Contra Internet, is presented in the exhibition Territories of Complicity in this year's festival. And Aria is an artist, writer, and curator based in Los Angeles. She currently holds the position of assistant curator of net art and digital culture at Rhizome. And she's also the co-director of the Los Angeles Gallery and Project Space as it stands LA. Please join me in welcoming Aria and Zach Blas.
Okay, cool.
Is it on?
Yeah, it's
okay. Hi, everyone.
Hi, I'm Aria.
I'm Zach.
I'm going to introduce myself first, talk a little bit about what I've been working on that pertains to the theme for the festival, and then I'll hand it over to Zach. But yeah, so I'm an artist, writer, and curator based in Los Angeles, and I work for Rhizome, which is based at the New Museum in New York. And over the last few years, my writing practice and artistic practice has focused primarily on race and gender and the internet, and art and aesthetics more broadly. I'm just going to kind of run through a few, I guess, main points of my practice over the last few years. I wrote an article 2 years ago for The New Inquiry called Closing the Loop that was about race and feminism in online feminist art practices that involved self-imaging and self-portraiture, and critiqued the whiteness of what I deemed selfie feminism in this context. And then after that, I wrote an article about memes on Instagram and Twitter and how they relate to blackness and how blackness circulates on the internet, both in the sense of how the black community circulates these images, but also how these images of often of black people circulate beyond their own movement and agency. So yeah, I think I'm kind of interested in images and bodies overall and how they move online and offline. Maybe it's the same thing. We'll get into that later. But and yeah, so more recently, I wrote something for eFlux called Notes on Black Acceleration, which sort of departed from those concerns, but extended certain things that were involved with that. And that essay sort of revisited accelerationism and questioned the basis of it, or questioned its basis in, or the account of capitalism that it's based on, and sort of proposed reinserting the idea of racial capitalism into like the grounding of that theory and sort of asking what that offers. So that's kind of what I've been up to. And I think that, most recently though, I think, and what I think is interesting about this conversation today is sort of getting an opportunity also to look at how that writing, some of the concerns that I've discussed in it, like how it's faded out of the picture in terms of what the internet looks like right now. I think even in the last 2 years, a lot has changed. How certain radical potentials have been lost, and asking what others have opened up since then. So that's my brief spiel.
Great. I'm an artist and writer as well, and I am presenting a work here in the exhibition called Contra Internet, which is a project I've been working on for a number of years that I guess the way that I think of it is trying to bring certain queer and feminist discourses and practices to bear on questions and politics around networks and the internet, in particular Paul Preciado's manifesto on contrasexuality. So I think a major driving question for me in that work is kind of taking up how Preciado theorizes the dildo as kind of this diagram or emblem for contrasexuality, and how to think something like, what are the dildo tectonics of the internet? I guess meaning if contrasexuality is about trying to articulate some kind of version, thank you, of sexuality is non-naturalized and non-heterosexual, as we're moving more and more towards a moment of the internet as something kind of naturalized and totalized, what is that figure like the dildo is for contrasexuality that kind of fractures some kind of totality or hegemony, which I think leads to something like the outside, which is a concept that Aria and I are going to talk about. And just to name some other work that I've done, because I think it's going to come up in the conversation for, my God, sorry, I'll just hold these. For a number of years, I've also done work around biometrics, particularly facial recognition, and thinking about that kind of broadly through different kind of minoritarian frameworks, whether that be feminism or queerness or anti-racism, and trying to think about biometrics not so much through this kind of kind of frequent common lens of surveillance versus privacy, but something more like opacity versus capture, in the sense of thinking about capture as some kind of algorithmic mode of standardizing identity and identification, and how that bears on these questions of identity and difference and kind of legacies of certain minoritarian struggles around gaining visibility and recognition to the state. I'm also working on a lot of new work around airport body scanners, kind of thinking around this question of provision, which you'll probably notice in all of the airports. The body scanner is called Provision, or my favorite, Provision 2. And just to kind of think about, what is this logic of provision, to kind of think of that as a concept that extends beyond the machine. And lots of stuff around security and gender, but I think that's enough maybe for us.
Yeah, we have a lot to
in.
talk. Yeah, we got a lot to talk about. And I think we're just gonna see how it rolls.
So, point one was going to be, we were going to talk about the face of the internet.
Which, I don't know if is that a phrase? I guess 'cause it's face value, but also I think we kind of combined, I don't know, somewhere in it we just mushed together this idea of the face of the internet. But I guess we can each sort of talk about it in relationship to our current and past work. For me, I think that what the face of the internet brings to mind, and where it intersects with what I've been thinking about, I think, is through this question of memes, which I find interesting because I wrote this essay about how memes circulate and how Blackness circulates on the internet, and that was in May of it was like a year or two ago, I can't remember, but basically I'm interested in how the situation has shifted a lot since the time of writing that. I think that basically what I focused on in that were both reaction GIFs and like Twitter and Instagram memes. I feel like it's like more fun to describe memes than to show you examples of them. So like, memes that have, there's that one, it's like the black guy like on the phone looking like kind of like angry. Like that's a good one. Or New York from Flavor of Love is featured in a lot of reaction GIFs. And she just in various ways. Anyway, so I was interested in how like black people online are used as like vessels for various emotional reactions or like pop cultural like landmarks or whatever. And I think that, I think that, one thing I was interested in is how I think that there's something in that that's connected to viewing like blackness and excess as related to each other, so that like black people as images could speak to something beyond themselves, and there was some sort of like way that was being used. But then also, looking at my notes, I guess and as an excess to be controlled as well. So often offered by someone who's not black. But then also I think in terms of this difference between then and now, since then there's after the election of Donald Trump, the conversation around memes kind of got more swept into this alt-right and like far-right internet situation. And so whatever radical potential or like even really like theoretical purchase that this idea of memes and blackness had kind of got sucked up into that. And so I guess where that leaves me is that one thing that beyond the sort of idea of cultural appropriation, which I think is what really got talked about a lot when I wrote that piece, like that was part of it. But what I was really interested in was the sort of ontological like situation of the meme and how the meme models this image ontology that's like an individual object that's entirely, it's not separable from its collective being as well. So, if there's an individual image of the meme with the black guy looking upset, that's the meme. But then there's also the whole ecology of that meme and its various iterations, and those two things are not separable from each other. And so I was interested in how that paralleled blackness for me as a sort of other kind of ontology where individual and collective is a really blurry, the boundaries are blurred between the two. So I guess, so I think that's something that I'm interested in terms of how the face of the internet maybe has shifted. And I think, I'll let you.
Yeah, I mean, maybe, what I feel, maybe the strand that I feel kind of connected to with that and, just the work that I've done, I think would be around the question of excess, and, where is the site of excess, and also the question of ontology. And I think, maybe just to kind of give a preview of what we'll talk about later, you're making me think of, one of the last essays that Glissant wrote, this phrase, the thinking of the opacity of the world, where Glissant described the world, in its totality as opacity. And, I think for me, it's another way to kind of think around excess as that which maybe extrudes or escapes, or however you want to kind of describe it, from maybe certain modes of, normalization, hegemony, capture, et cetera.
Yeah.
And so I think, the way, I guess, maybe I was thinking about this at a different scale, because I became really interested in, if, one way we could talk about the face of the internet is just how it's always visually represented. And I'm quite interested in why is the internet always represented as the world? Why is the internet always visually given to us as the world? Because of course it suggests a kind of totalized relationship between the world and the internet. And I think, this strikes me as very problematic in the sense that, I feel like it's a classically kind of minoritarian question to want to, or a desire to want to kind of fracture these types of totalities. And I think the kind of, I guess the opposite side of that is, to me, it seems like this, to think of the internet as the totalized world seems to be like, a dream drive of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. Here I think of someone like Eric Schmidt, who I think is now CEO of Alphabet, which is the company that owns Google. And in 2014 at the World Economic Forum, he was asked to predict the future of the internet, and he provocatively said, that it will disappear. But of course, what he meant, he's referring to the Internet of Things, the kind of deeper, further kind of dispersal of the internet. So basically you would get, this kind of collapsing into the world and the internet. So I don't know, that just seems like a really interesting, complicated, and like a problematic, a conceptual and political problematic to think through and like, I think, untangle.
Yeah. I was gonna say, I think, this is going out of order sort of, but with the excess thing, I think something else that in the meme conversation I was interested in trying to tease out was, the idea of like hiding in excess, I suppose. And so like that if there's this mass of memes, like massive images that, you can't really pick through them or sort out, sort of drawing on this, hedo poor image sort of idea as well. If you can't pick through that and parse through it, then maybe there's some sort of, liberatory possibility within, existing in that way. And I think that and I think also it challenges, like in its paralleling of Blackness, or that I sort of attempted to tease out, I think it also kind of it sort of begins to travel into the realm of a discussion about like the like non-human, and sort of like how do we challenge the idea of like an individual subjectivity, and maybe it's partially through this kind of excessive subjectivity where the boundaries between, quote unquote subjects no longer really stand. So
yeah, I think that to me, I think that really connects with Glissant's, picture of the world as opaque, because it has to do with the production of subjectivity in the way that one actually has a relation to oneself, but also, of course, it is about relation. Like opacity was another way for him to describe the poetics and ethics of relation. So I think there is that kind of element of collectivity bound within it. But I guess the other way I had a lot of different ways of trying to think about the face of the internet, and I think one was more like a man in the moon kind of way of trying to make, through something like personification, where, if the internet took the face of a human, who would that be? And maybe it's because, this film that I made, I spent a lot of time reading and researching the writer and philosopher Ayn Rand. I think maybe if not her face, then maybe something like a mashup of her face and Atlas. And I think I just wanted to bring up Atlas, the mythological figure, because I think there's something really interesting in kind of thinking through these longer kind of, I guess maybe philosophical and fictional writings around the world and how they bear on the internet. So Atlas is the mythological figure that holds up the sky, although he's often visualized and interpreted as the figure that has to bear the weight of the world. And there's a moment, so Ayn Rand, one of her most well-known books is called Atlas Shrugged, and it begins with what she calls the men of the mind, which are artists, entrepreneurs, and they go on strike against the world as they know it, because the social structures of the world are forcing them to, they're not being able to kind of live up to their individual potential. So they go on strike against the world as they know it. And there's a moment in the book where a character is like kind of talking about how would you respond to Atlas, this figure that has to bear the weight of the world. And the character says, well, I would tell Atlas to shrug. And I think, this kind of attitude of turning away from the world, kind of letting go of the world, not taking responsibility for the world. I think there's something kind of within that around these questions of the world and the internet. And in part just because, Ayn Rand is this figure that Silicon Valley has so kind of deeply taken up. And I think the way maybe we can see that moving forward is when we look at these representations of the internet as the world. It's kind of a perfectly networked world. So it seems to be the kind of Californian ideology, the techno-utopianism is that, of course, we can tell Atlas to shrug because global infrastructure, does the work of supporting and caring for the world. And there doesn't need to be that kind of social investment in taking care. So, yeah, and I don't know, that's just, I've been thinking a lot about this. So, I think this question of the internet, its relationship to the world, and then also these questions of, I think, responsibility and taking care seem really crucial. Yeah. And they're definitely connected to, I think, the politics we're both committed to and interested in. Yeah,
I think that and we talked about maybe talking about this, and we decided, identity and social media, I think is something I think that what you're saying about, the internet being represented as the world, I think is something that's been weighing on me more and more as I feel like I see, like, not just that, like, the ideology that's, like, in the hands of those who are creating the infrastructure being that the internet is real, but also in the, way that users conceptualize, or like people conceptualize their experiences on the internet, in the sense that, like, there is no outside to your experience as a user, and that your relationships, like, are, like, truly, like, ontologically, like, structured by, like, I'm, like, a black woman who's 24 on Twitter, like, that sort of mentality. And I think that there's, I think, a growing need, and, like, I'm becoming more and more interested in, like, a really nuanced critique of, like, that from the perspective of, like, like, world and internet. Anyway, but that's sort of a side comment.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, taking the... to think more directly or specifically around social media, of course, that's another way to think about, how we as users and engagers of the internet kind of take a face, which I think also, we were talking about this, that also involves a kind of production of subjectivity, but also, right, I think we're both interested in a kind of critique of identity around social media. And I have a friend of mine, Jacob Gabry, came up with this really great phrase where he, talked about social media as a form of kind of compulsory identification, kind of taking this idea from Judith Butler about how, Judith Butler would talk about, like, the compulsory order of heterosexuality. And I think, right, I guess, like, maybe the kind of queer critique around social media would be, when something like Facebook expands its options for identifying. Of course, there's, like, maybe you want to be positive about that and think, this is fantastic, it gives me a way to more kind of,
like, accurately.
More accurately identify. But of course, the other side of that is it just becomes a way for you to be more accurately kind of classified within.
When we talked about it before, I feel like for me, like, I think, like, that compulsory identification is a wonderful way of putting it. And as well, it's like this Wendy Brown, like, sort of, like, I was rereading, yesterday I was rereading Wounded Attachments from States of Injury, and, like, she phrases it as, like, you make yourself, like, more easily classifiable, more, and, like, and in order to perform these identities, or there's this call to perform these identities that we believe to be political or subversive or, like, authentic or true to who we are, but at the same time, we're consistently classifying and categorizing and, like, disciplining ourselves through that as well, which is, I don't know, it's between a rock and a hard place in a lot of ways.
Well, and I also, maybe it's, I don't think I don't have the answer to this at all, but to think about something like revolutionary subjectivity, I think we were both wondering, is that possible?
What is it?
Is that possible, like, through social media? And I guess,
Yeah.
I was telling you this last night, but however old-fashioned, or, like, not old-fashioned, but, like, maybe not as popular as it used to be, I was a student of Michael Hart, and I think one thing that really kind of clicked with me, or, like, that really had an impact on me through Hart and Negri's writings was the section in Commonwealth actually on queerness and revolutionary identity. And I think, one of the things that I thought they kind of, how they beautifully theorized queerness was that they say something that queerness is the most revolutionary of identity politics because it's premised on the dissolution of identity itself, in the sense that for them, revolution has to imply some kind of fundamental transformation of things like gender, things like identity, class, etc. And it seems like, if I kind of follow that logic of transformation, I guess, I don't know, you're right. It seems like a rock and a hard place.
Well, I think in writing the notes on Black Acceleration thing, I was also trying to get at that kind of question or answer of, like, okay, like, if there can be a revolutionary subject of any sort right now, like, in this contemporary internet, like, networked moment, then what could it be? And I think that for me, I was interested in interrogating Blackness in a similar way, like, and maybe not so much in terms of transformation, but I think in terms of, like, antagonism and like, Blackness, and we talked about this as well, like, the sort of, like, queerness and Blackness as these sort of, like, material forces or whatever, like, rather than just simply as identities, but how Blackness, like, antagonizes the history of like, Western philosophy and capital and all these things, and and maybe this is a good segue into the outside, but sort of in some ways constitutes an outside that is constantly enclosed in a system that produced it, and kind of like, I mean, I guess it's sort of like that Moten and like Fred Moten in The Break kind of idea as well. But yeah, I think that the Black acceleration thing was an attempt to begin to suggest that maybe the way that the like quote unquote Black subject or non-subject has been constituted might be a useful revolutionary subject due to like the history of capital or something. But yeah.
Well, I mean, also I think since you brought up the kind of the point about, let's say, like materialism or materiality, you know, and to think about queerness and blackness as something that has material weight that just can't be kind of like whittled down to, you know, kind of the play of like language, post-structuralism, performativity. You know, maybe that's an interesting way to go, you know, more deeper into opacity, because, you know, I think like one key there is that, you know, something like identity and identification is squarely within the realm of difference, the logic of difference. And, you know, Glissant has that really beautiful part in the For Opacity essay where he very clearly states that opacity is what goes beyond difference. You know, and I think that's a quite clear articulation about opacity kind of moving into this other terrain. And I think there's just like a real robustness and deep generosity to that concept where, you know, it's at once ontological, it's political, it's ethical, it's aesthetic. And I think it actually has the capacity to be, you know, this kind of concept of alliances where I think it can really hold together queerness and feminism, anti-racism, you know, a decolonial project.
Yeah. Definitely. Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, maybe we should talk about the outside now, because which like, yeah, is like a very, I mean, we've just been throwing that around as like the way to sort of encompass, I guess a lot of stuff. But I mean, I think that like, for me, what I've written down is, I think an interesting way of entering this is, I mean, I think that concept of paranodes that you were talking about in Contra Internet was really interesting, and I think this idea of the black outdoors that we also have talked about, which was this panel discussion at Duke University with Fred Moten and Saidiya Hartman, and yeah, I mean, I guess like the way that they phrase the question, which I thought was really great, because I think it does go beyond, I think like the outside sort of at first glance gives you the sense of withdrawal, or like, you know, you like, how do we get like outside and like stay outside? And, you know, in terms of the internet might bring to mind like some sort of like Luddite position or something like that, or like, yeah, like drop off the grid, like whatever. but I think that the way that Moten and Hartman phrased it was like, how do you get outside while you are stuck inside, which you know, we said before, and I think that that's really interesting. And I think for the internet, I think it, for me, means like, yeah, how do we get around the infrastructure? Like, how do we like kind of like wiggle into the in-between spaces and exploit the network or the infrastructure, I suppose. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Moten and Saidiya Hartman, you know, work around the Black Outdoors is incredibly productive, and again, I think it kind of connects to this. I think older and, you know, also kind of like really vibrant, again, like minoritarian work around the outside, because I think that's a concept that's very operative today. And I think a lot of philosophy that doesn't really care too much about questions around feminism or queerness or anti-racism. And so for me, you know, like the kind of, especially with the Contra Internet work, like a major kind of focal point to think the outside was through J.K. Gibson Graham, who wrote a book in the early 90s called The End of Capitalism as We Knew It. And these were two women that wrote under one name. And the kind of, I guess the takeaway from that book is that it's partially framed as a critique of the left, and particularly certain kinds of political philosophers that choose to theorize capitalism as having no outside, which for them, you know, they kind of find as a little almost sadistic, in the sense that to theorize capitalism as having no outside, you know, kind of forecloses the possibility of this outside, which again, I think it kind of brings us back to the images of the internet and the internet as a totalized world. It's like, well, if the internet is a totalized world, you know, where is the outside? But I think the point is J.K. Gibson Graham, with their engagement with capitalism, actually choose to redefine capitalism. So it becomes the first kind of part of their theoretical work together is, reframing, reconceptualizing this based on, what they call like non-economic practices, or just economic practices that exist within the world, however small and local, that that aren't operating to them under like a capitalist logic. And so I think the way that they do this is that, so then their theory of, they have a theory of post-capitalist politics, and that refers to the economic alternatives at work in the world within the supposedly totalized frame of capital. And I think it's like a really fun theoretical game to funnel post-internet through their theory of post-capitalism, because I think you get to a much more interesting place. And I think you get to a place where there is kind of a stake in the political horizon of what's possible.
Yeah, I think it's like, in terms of mapping that onto the internet, what would be like the kinds of practices that would be like post-internet in this new, in like the new post-internet? Like,
well, I think again, these are kind of small examples, but I do think there's like interesting activist projects happening around the world that are invested in kind of autonomous infrastructure. Like, I think the Digital Stewards in Detroit are quite interesting. They're involved with the Allied Media Project and do social justice work around kind of building community networks. But I also think, so I think there are these kind of examples that are practical, that are happening around the world. I'm not saying, they're like fundamentally shifting well, I don't know. It's just, it just, for me, they open up a space of possibility, which I think is really crucial, because it fractures the totality, and we get the kind of, the way that Glissant imagined the kind of constellation of islands, and not the totalized world, all wrapped up as one. And then I think the other part, which is, which you brought up about the paranodes, is I think there's another kind of question which could be more theoretical or also creative or artistic, which is, how does one imagine or think beyond the network form? And I think that that idea of the paranode comes from Ulysses Alimiejas in his book Off the Network, where the last chapter is called The Outside of Networks as a Method for Acting in the World. And he kind of talks about, he calls network logic nodocentrism, kind of like, riffing on things like logocentrism, this kind of thing, where the network logic becomes a kind of a dominating logic or map or diagram that organizes social reality. And that attends to things, leaves other things out. And so his idea of the paranode is the space that, the network kind of diagram excludes. Something that I wonder, and I don't expect us to be able to answer this while we're here, but I wonder about the sort of, I was thinking about the J.K. Gibson Graham idea about like thinking about the outside. I wonder about, because I guess I'm thinking about this Notes on Black Acceleration thing, and I feel like my relationship to the idea of there being an outside or not an outside to capitalism, I think, is complicated, because I feel like with the idea of blackness and capital, like I wonder about, because the concept of blackness and being black as we understand it to exist now, comes from the Atlantic slave trade and capital, and it's kickstarted by this, so then what's the I get you see where I'm going, like how do we conceptualize the outside of capitalism in maybe I wonder if it throws a wrench or adds another layer. I think it does. I think for me, the productive way to think about that would be kind of an additive process. Like, how do you bring together something like J.K. Gibson Graham, which of course, it has its limitations, but how do you bring that kind of certain commitment to the outside in alignment with something like Moten and something like maybe that's more materialist and ontological, the idea of fugitivity. I think that seems like a really exciting project to kind of to figure out how to think the outside in this much more broad, open way that's attending to these. That's attending to these things. I also, the other thing that brought up, which we hadn't spoken about yesterday, was I think this paranode thing and thinking not just thinking about the nodes and the lines between them, sort of
reminded me of Laruelle's like genericism and stuff. And I don't know, I love that stuff. I think it's really fun. and
I was actually going to ask you about Laruelle
Really?
last night, because I was curious what you thought about. You
Yeah.
know? I mean, there is this other strand of philosophy that takes blackness, that takes darkness as kind of the alien other.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
it always like that kind of H.P. Lovecraft
Right.
inspired theory, and it always
Yeah.
kind of goes to black as like maybe like it's like the form of non-correlationism and speculative realism, but there's never a reckoning.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like, I mean, it sort of is what drew me to writing the Notes on Black Exploration thing, in the same way where I, came across these blog posts where it was like, it was circling the question of blackness in terms of race like so intensely in like the language, but it wasn't even like a thing where it seemed like anyone was like trying not to talk about it. It just was like this blind spot. And I think with like that kind of theory as well, it's this thing where it's like everyone's talking about the color black and like space and like the utter darkness and like black holes, but it never gets anchored in any conversation about like race or blackness in terms of black people. But the way that it's talked about has such resonance, and I think there's a complicated, and this maybe gets into the question of methodology, which I think we were both interested in talking about as well, where there's this thing where I'm like, okay, well, this is really potent and interesting for what I'm interested in, but is it like it's exoticizing in some ways to use it in terms of race, or I feel like there's a really complicated thing that has to happen in bringing it into that space where it's like taking it with a grain of salt, I suppose, is kind of what it boils down to. But and I think with like the accelerationism stuff, it took a lot of like kind of twisting my mind up to be like, okay, like I'm just gonna, or it's sort of like this like non-consensual like bringing together of ideas where it's kind of like, and we talked about this before too, like people who who some of the the great like really wonderful theory that we talked about in the last like day. I think it's people who are like, I know what, I'm just going to put these things together that you might not think should go together, and I think that's an interesting thing to do. That got really tangential, but
yeah, I mean, maybe like I'll just I'll say, I mean, one thing that I kind of thought was thinking about blackness when I was doing the work around biometrics and trying to think about like what is biometric blackness, like there seemed to me that what needs to happen there is like you can't let certain things fall away. Like there's I kind of thought of it as like a knot of blackness or something where, when you think about that through questions of race and racialization, of course, there's like deep problems around, political violence. But then when you start to think about blackness, maybe like more from an informatic perspective, like it becomes this kind of thing that obscures. And of course, we see that when like there are these, examples from some years ago of, people with black skin that aren't recognized by, computers. And so it's just this kind of really, and of course there's writing on this, but, this complication of, something that's like this knot where on the one hand could be like a vector out.
Well, it's like the Moten quote where he's like, that we have blackness as it is attached to people who are marked as black in society or in our world, but then there's also blackness as this like non-thing in the universe that's like a force that's acting between objects and individuals as well, which I think is that knot that I think is like, and then maybe it's like this thing that also ideas and objects can have a relationship to that isn't conscious in the sense that it's been like you know what I mean, I don't know, like there can be that kernel as well, but that's like really like woo.
Well, maybe like we're almost out of time, but maybe we could say something. We wanted to talk about methodology because we're both artists and writers, and we both enjoy using theory in ways that aren't just so precisely academic. And I think like for me, I guess an artist I studied under, Ricardo Dominguez, always talked about two methodologies that I just think will like hold on until the day I die, which was the burrito and utopian plagiarism. And the idea with the burrito was kind of this like, you can cram in as much as you want. You just have to have that tortilla that wraps together and holds it all. And but the other part about utopian plagiarism, which was like this idea of taking texts, concepts, swapping words out, and just seeing if you can, like quickly actually open up a new kind of pathway for thought where, what you've kind of plagiarized out of still haunts this new path. And I think the kind of key example of this from Critical Art Ensemble would be something like electronic civil disobedience. And I think with me, kind of doing this work around contra-internet, contra-sexual, thinking about J.K. Gibson Graham, and I have this video here that's playing that's like all about utopian plagiarism. I mean, I think for me it's about kind of, I mean, well, we talked about it as, or I was telling you, like one way I think about it is citational politics and thinking about all those feminist theory courses of making sure you have good citational politics, and you know, trying to find a way to actually bring that into a practice in a different way. And I think, I find that a really productive way to engage with theory, and it just kind of lets, I guess I just think the words that get subbed out, you know, if internet replaces capitalism or internet replaces sexual, that those words linger and kind of stay in this kind of maybe like ghostly way, and they bring those, they bring those theories forward. And I guess I also just like to show that this work that was being written in the 90s, that maybe seemingly doesn't have anything to do with these questions today, is like actually so is so adequate to kind of confront some of these problems.
I think I'm really interested in that as well. Like I think there's like a whole there's like all this knowledge that's produced like well before these questions of the internet as we know it have cropped up, but like I really like, for instance, that Wendy Brown text that I've been like obsessing over because I've recently reread it and I was like, this like you don't even really have to sub anything out. It just like tells you what you need to know. And like I wish every kid I'd gone to college with had read that. I wish we'd all read it when we got there. We would have like saved ourselves a lot of, you know, time and whatever. But I think with method, I think it's interesting. I think for me I don't often use this like, you know, aphorism or cite it, but that Audre Lorde like Master's House thing, like I'm like, I don't really know how I feel about this because I love using, you know, racist old German like philosophers and because I think that there are things that I can get from that, and there are obviously things that I also want to leave at the door. But I think that, you know, having, I don't know, like I think I do in some ways think that it's important, and I think for myself, I'm very interested in like allowing myself to have a relationship to those texts. And then maybe the goal is to subvert them in the end, or not. I don't necessarily believe that it's going to be either or, but I think that's. But we probably should take questions.
I think so.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.
I have a question. Like, because you talk about the problematic between talking about the internet as the world.
Yeah, so you're talking about the problematic of making the equality between the internet and the world, but then still when you talk about the internet, you talk very much about the Anglian English language internet, no? It feels to me, because like all the examples you use are from that. And then like issues like, I don't know, like Blackness. In the Hispanic world, it's a completely different thing, no? So also then on the Hispanic internet, it's a different thing. So isn't it important, if we want to talk about the totality of it, and so to also recognize that there's other kind of localities of internet, like there is Chinese internet and a Hispanic internet, and so
I mean, of course. I think, look, I mean, I can't speak for everything, and I think, you know, I am from the US, I'm trained in the US, so, you know, I'm not going to claim that I can speak to those topics because I can't. I mean, I think what, you know, I'm particularly interested in with that comment was to think about, I guess on the one hand, you know, I think the exploration around the internet and the world first began just by doing, you know, different image searches on search engines and just kind of thinking about why does this always come up the same. And I think the second, maybe I should have clarified this, you know, a lot of the research I'm doing and the film that I made is very much about Silicon Valley. So I think, you know, for me, it's very much about this vision that comes from Silicon Valley, you know, about a certain idea of, you know, what they're doing, how they're inventing, and how that will totalize the world, which of course, you know, is deeply problematic because, right, it's one little area in California where you have a lot of people that are deeply powerful that are making decisions that affect the world. And I think it's like, I mean, I guess that's for me the kind of problematic that I'm interested in.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of Blackness, I also would say I'm speaking from my perspective as an American, like, Black person, I suppose, but also with an interest in the position of America in the production of Blackness, like as a global phenomenon as well. So, but definitely like with the humbleness of like I can only speak to my understanding from my perspective. But yeah. There's one right there. It's like hard. It's hard to see. Like.
Okay, hi. I kind of want to go back to the point where you were saying about how the internet is access, and back to where you were talking about how the atlas is kind of like holding the world, and I kind of want to bring the point of how any signifiers, like desktop signifiers, image signifiers of the internet have always been globes. So like it would either be a compass, or like Mozilla has like that weird fire thing going above it. And I kind of want to talk about how the internet may be accessed because the world in that sort of framework is also access, but at the same time how this access gives agency, and the internet gives agency to a form of appropriation. For example, like you were talking about black acceleration and about memes kind of flooding cultures that aren't necessarily their own, if that makes sense. So would you consider the internet to actually be a force that gives agency to something that may be quite negative in a way?
Yeah, I mean that's a great point. I mean, of course, I definitely think the internet gives lots of different kinds of agency. I guess, again, I guess putting my hat on as a visual artist, like what was interesting to me about that again is like the difference between like material realities and then how something is getting not just represented, but how something is like actually being prophesied. You know, I think of like that comment that Eric Schmidt made as literally like a kind of prophecy of what's to come, this collapsing into the internet and the world. So, but of course that's an ideological construction. And I think there's, we could think of plenty of different examples that cut both ways, where people are provided different kinds of agency.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like with the examples you're mentioning, I feel like it's like this, the weird sort of colonial, the weird colonial visual presence of the internet is really fascinating when you think about the history just of even of those icons, and I think to me it speaks mostly, and as well as I think what you're saying, and then also the situation of memes, I think both are exemplary of the fact that the internet really just in a lot of ways just more deeply entrenches the relations that we see and concretizes relations we see elsewhere. And so whatever agency one might have, I don't know, I don't think there's a huge gap between the kinds of agency that one might have in the quote unquote real world and online, in terms of, yeah, that's kind of poorly phrased, but.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very lively, engaging conversation. And I'd like to pick up on two very core kind of concepts which I felt weren't fully explored, which is now very unfair to ask of you at the end maybe, but there's maybe an entry into this. So on the other hand, you were talking about black surrealism, and I think, Zach, in your practice you have also the queering as a methodology. And I was interested in this spark of nerdy enthusiasm from Aria when L'Oreal was mentioned, and you mentioned generic and genericity, or genericism as a kind of maybe that's a way into that, because also here in the context of this festival, Transmediale as a digital culture festival, the way it's very important, perhaps, concepts that you're touching upon there, because we use this field, digital culture, which is very, very generic today, and try to do something different with it. What in the end is coming out of that? What new agencies and powers? And maybe you can speak about your two concepts, perhaps touching also on L'Oreal's ideas.
Go for it.
Well, so I guess black accelerationism is the concept that you were saying could be explored. So basically, I mean, and it's not really a formal theory of any. I think it would be. It's very loose concepts. But basically what I proposed in this essay was that the accelerationist account of capital would benefit, or has lost steam because, at least in part, of a lack of attention towards racial capitalism as the core underpinning of capital as we understand it in the West. So that like there is no capitalism, there's no like late capitalism today without slavery in the Americas, and how that is like a historical problem. But then also I think and I basically looked at early blog posts about like as accelerationism was like being coined or whatever, how this search for like a revolutionary subject that then left accelerationism sort of loses sight of and sort of just gets into like post-work and automation, like blah, 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 like it, but loses this sort of more theoretical and sort of like ontological question. I basically looped back and proposed that perhaps the black non-subject would be this revolutionary subject that could engender this sort of like accelerationist like revolution or something. But I don't think it's like, I don't consider it a practical solution, or like I don't think it's like an actionable politic necessarily, but I think it's just sort of mapping a hole in a discourse and trying to fill it in a bit with something that I think that already was a part of it. It was happening in Black radical thought in like the 70s, one could say. And with the generic, I think that I don't know. I think that for me, I got interested in Laurel and the generic. I think in part because I think kind of gave language to some of the stuff I was interested in about memes and this sort of continuous and discrete ontology that doesn't really have to land on either side, and it's different from collectivity. It's just this like generic, like as its own concept. And I think that, yeah, in terms of, well, I don't know, do you have any thoughts on the digital culture being that part? I don't know, like.
I mean, yeah, I can just jump in.
Yeah,
I think, maybe, the generic broadly understood certainly unites us, but I think there's a lot of different ways to understand that. There's kind of, let's say, like a proliferation of concepts, like also in media theory, but also in political philosophy that articulate that in different ways. And I think, let's say, like going back to Hart Negri again, it would be like using the figure of Bartleby as a way to kind of talk about like escape or withdrawal. I think you have like, again, like a strand I think we were kind of indirectly critiquing, which is like invisibility a la the Invisible Committee and like, let's just all move to like Tarnac. But I think like there are these like more kind of like more pinned down kind of articulations of like what could be understood as like a kind of critique of identity politics, but also a position that like really takes a direct stake in like minoritarian politics very broadly. And I guess for me, to bring up queerness, like I think like I just kind of arrived at, let's say, an impasse with queerness, because I think that, look, it's like, I mean, I'll never like fully turn my back on that as a concept, but I think like you get to a point where you're like, okay, is this concept like doing the work that it needs to do? And I think that so much of queerness often gets kind of trapped within, again, I think like a post-structural kind of malaise of just like language games. And I think it's kind of how, like for me, it's like actually arrived at opacity, through queerness. And I do think of opacity as a kind of queerness, but it has a certain material ontological dimension that I think is like deeply productive, and it's able to kind of extend and expand. And I think a lot, maybe for me, the investigation or the commitment to like whatever queer is that, if you take that seriously in relationship to power and technology, then queerness would like really kind of reinvent itself. Because I mean, it's not to say that like concepts like heteronormativity like aren't important. I think they're deeply important, but also the conception of power that something like heteronormativity often relies on is very human-centric. So like if you actually expand these to kind of take in non-human factors that actually deeply bear on politics and power, queerness might look different. And I think one way I've kind of thought about this in the past is like, maybe there are these debates in queer theory about like, should we just like throw out the critique of normativity? Like, isn't that queerness's like normativity to critique normativity? But there could be another way to kind of engage that, which like might be, maybe normativity is too broad or like not specific enough. Maybe it's about protocol or the protocological. Like maybe like queerness Reimagine would be something counter-protocological. Yeah. And I think like it opens up to these, I think, I guess, we're living in a moment where, it's like, it's just so common to, be interested in these theories and politics, and people always say, oh, we're not living in the 90s anymore. Like, weren't those problems just completely solved?
Right.
And it's like, identity or identification, you could say, is like back with a vengeance.
Yeah. Well,
and
I think it's also like people, like it sort of feels left alone, or like left people like, oh, we figured that out. But then at the same time, like it's back with a vengeance. Then also I think there's this problem of, and this is like jumping into a whole other thing we probably have to finish, but the like critique itself, I think also is this like overarching mode of engagement, but like critique, like not really like a nuanced grappling with topics, but more of like this sort of, like reactive, like, oh, like we don't like that thing because it's like we're critiquing power, but it's like, well, no, you're critiquing like, I don't know. I think that's getting into a whole other.
I mean, we could say it just like throws a wrench into like the long investment in gaining visibility and recognition. Whether you're thinking about gay rights, women's rights, that these kind of the way, like I just. I guess an example that I've been thinking about a lot is, with airport body scanners and how, like you have, transgender bodies, getting kind of like flagged for like on like pre-terrorist suspicions. And I think like that to me is kind of a deep play on, capture, computational, kind of standards of identification getting solidified in those kinds of machines that like, of course, can't process like maybe the material excess of that body, which is why, again, like a concept like embodiment, is quite old, but I actually think it's like deeply crucial to what we're talking about.
Definitely. All right, well, I think that we're out of time.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you for coming. Yeah, it went well. I feel like we're good. Yeah.